Good evening, everyone. My name is Alex Hayes. I'm Head of Development for Arts and Divinity at the University of St Andrews, and a very warm welcome to this evening's Saints Talk, entitled Adventures in Three Dimensions, How Early Modern Publishers Explored New Ways of Representing the World, which will be given by Professor Laura Moretti, Head of the School of Art History here at St Andrews. Professor Moretti took her undergraduate degree in architecture. Her PhD is in architectural history, and she's been working for several years on the relationship between architecture and music. She's held prestigious postdoctoral and research positions at the University of Cambridge, at Worcester College, Oxford, and at Villa Itati, the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies. She is also an accomplished cellist, although I'm told that sadly we may not have time for a performance this evening. Professor Moretti is also director of Thinking 3D, an interdisciplinary exploration of the concept of three-dimensionality and its impact on the arts and sciences. And it's this area of her research that is the focus of her talk this evening. Thinking 3D is an innovative project which puts the minds of the 21st century in touch with those of early practitioners exploring three-dimensionality through a series of exhibitions, events, public talks, gallery shows, and academic symposia. With the introduction of book printing, draftsmen, artists, and publishers explored new ways of representing the three-dimensional world. This evening's talk will explore how technological advancements and artistic ingenuity met on the pages of books printed between the 15th and the 17th centuries. Laura will speak for 30 to 40 minutes, after which you'll have the opportunity to ask her questions, and I warmly encourage you to do that. Please do submit your questions in the chat. You can do that at any point during the talk, and we will wrap up promptly by 6:15. Well, it's a dark, cold and frosty evening here in Northeast Fife, and I, for one, am very much looking forward to being transported to the Renaissance of Leonardo, Dürer and Palladio. So I will now hand over to Professor Laura Moretti to take us on some adventures in three dimensions. Laura.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Alex, and thank you all for joining us today. In the 15th century, the world witnessed a revolution. The invention of printing meant that words and images could be transmitted on the pages of industrially produced artifacts via multiple copies which could travel in space and time. With the development of the techniques of printing with movable types, arose in parallel the illustrated book. At the same time, thanks to artists like Filippo Brunelleschi, Leon Battista Alberti, Piero della Francesca, and in Northern Europe, Albrecht Dürer, new ways of representing the three-dimensional world, namely one-point perspective, developed. While it was relatively straightforward to apply those principles to painting, drawing, and even manuscript books, the newborn invention took a while to adapt. In the next 30 minutes, I will show you some remarkable examples of how artistic ingenuity and technological advancement found their way on the flat surface of the printed page in this extraordinary period of experimentation. The work I present today stems from the project Thinking 3D, which I developed in 2015-20 with Daryl Green, now head of Heritage Collections and co-director of the Centre for Research Collections at the University of Edinburgh. The project saw the participation of several institutions and culminated in an exhibition at the Bodleian Libraries in Oxford. The project was centered on the development of the techniques used to communicate three-dimensional forms in two-dimensional media. We engaged with hundreds of artifacts produced over a broad chronological span, from the 1st century CE to the present day, in a wide geographical area, mainly Europe, but with several relevant examples from the East. Today, I shall focus on books printed in Europe between the second half of the 15th and the second half of the 17th century. On the left, we see a page of a fantastic manuscript produced in England in the late 13th century, while on the right, we can see a detail of the Cambridge University Library copy of the so-called Epitome by Andreas Vesalius, printed in Basel in 1543. Almost 3 centuries separate these two objects. During this time, scientific advancements and illustration techniques evolved substantially, though the manuscript on the left presents some characteristics that the printed book on the right couldn't yet compete with. Let's take a closer look to the manuscript. What is particularly interesting is the absolute fluidity between the illustrations and the text. The drawings are interlocked with the words, which emerge all around organs and body parts, and between the limbs of these extraordinary mannequins, each characterized by an intense facial expression. Color is strategically used to highlight relevant sections in the diagrams. It is possible that the same draftsman who was penning the text was also in charge of the image's layout. With the invention of the printing press, things changed dramatically, and book production became a collective enterprise. Several individuals, each one with their specialized task to carry forward, were involved in a stringent set of operations. Movable type was composed by hand for each page. A tray with many dividers, called a case, contained cast metal swords, each with a single letter or symbol. These swords were assembled into words, then lines, then pages of text, which were then bound tightly together by a frame, making up a form. The form was then placed in a press and inked, and then printed on paper. Metal type read backwards from the right to left, and a key skill of the artisan setting the swords was to be able to read this backwards text. Illustrations were added via wooden blocks. The method originated in China in antiquity, was transmitted in Europe in the 13th century, where it developed massively only during the 15th century. At the time the first book with movable types appeared in Europe, mid-15th century, woodcut illustration was already well established. Here we see a woodcut realized by Albrecht Dürer at the end of the 15th century. The original printing block is still preserved. We see it here on the left. As we can notice, what is printed in black in the image on the right are the areas left in relief on the printing block, in analogy of what happens with the movable types. Shadowing, i.e. three-dimensionality, was obtained with thin lines placed on one close to the other, as we can see in these encircled areas. It was a very laborious and time-consuming process, which required highly specialized craftsmen. In 1461, Albrecht Pfister issued a book of fables by Ulrich Bonner, a Dominican monk. This was the first dated book with woodcut illustrations printed in Europe and contained 101 illustrations. The woodcuts were impressed by hand in blanks left for the purpose in the printed text, much as though they had been rubber stamps. You can see how the little monk on the left appeared in multiple pages, economically rather convenient. The copy we see here was watercolored by hand. In his Fasciculus Medicinae, Johannes de Kettam, a professor at the University of Vienna around the middle of the 15th century, used images of the human body for didactic explanatory purposes. Printed in Venice in 1495, the volume contained some full-page woodblock images to help the reader understanding the complex functioning of the human body. The diagrams were accompanied by small sections of explanatory texts, which were related to the image through thin lines. It was difficult to create seamless connections between text and image, and the illustration looks more like a schematic diagram than the representation of an actual three-dimensional human body. Although these are relatively simple images, let us remember that these are the years when Albrecht Dürer was creating masterpieces such as the one we saw previously. It is important to underline the effort to illustrate the human body and its functioning in an analytical and easy understandable way. This is indeed one of the first illustrated editions of anatomy and was republished several times in different cities. In the same years, Leonardo da Vinci was delineating a program of writing an ambitious group of treatises, each consisting of several books on a broad range of topics. Looking at Leonardo's drawings produced around 1500, it seems clear that printing technology was not yet ready to sustain this level of visual richness. None of these treatises saw the light in printed form during the artist's lifetime. During Leonardo's lifetime, the only printed illustrations based on his drawings were the geometrical forms published in Luca Pacioli's De Divina Proportione. Here we see one of Leonardo's preparatory drawings on the left and the printed version on the right, published in Venice in 1509. It is important to underline that at the time Venice was one of the most important centers for the development of printing, and the city maintained its leadership for the whole 16th century. The illustration on the right is schematic and straight to the point, but lacks the fantastic inventiveness of Leonardo's drawing, where the geometric solid is represented as an actual physical object appended to a cartouche via a decorative wire with nicely convoluted ends. A good compromise between the freedom of artistic ingenuity and the rigidities of mass production techniques was still challenging to reach. In just a few decades, technology made great strides, while production processes became more economically sustainable. In June 1543, the Basel printer Johannes Oporinus published a lavishly illustrated folio volume of 663 pages under the title De Humani Corporis Fabrica Libri Septem by Andreas Vesalius of Brussels, an absolute masterpiece which unfortunately Leonardo da Vinci had not a chance to see during his lifetime. As we can see in this example, illustration techniques were very advanced, and the images contained letters which were referred to in the text on the opposite page. The over 200 large plates and smaller illustrations are not simply scientific. They show a deliberate attempt to produce beautiful images, not only scientifically accurate, but also artistically striking. Here we see two illustrations from the same edition where the human bodies resemble antique marble statues. To a great extent, these illustrate the Renaissance in science, where the human body is conceived as an object of representation as well as of scientific investigation. In the same year, Oporinus published also Vesalius's Epitome, which we saw earlier. Here we can see how the edition came out of the press. As you can notice, the same illustrations on the page on the left appears also on the page of the right. This is because many of these images were intended to be cut off the pages and pasted in sequence one on top of the other to show the different anatomical structures and systems. In the copy of the Epitome preserved at Cambridge University Library, the sophisticated coloring and the juxtaposition of flaps, some of which were glued on waste paper to increase strength and durability, attest a post-production process, which was essentially in the hands of the book owner, who could decide whether to leave the printed pages untouched, as we saw in the previous slide, or to attempt the cut and paste, and coloring and reinforcing with waste paper in this case, process. Anatomical flap books and fugitive sheets, single sheets with flaps, which could be fixed on the wall, became very popular in the 16th century. Illustrations of the internal organs and structures represented various stages of dissection, ideally allowing the viewer to embark on a trip within the human body. The organs and structures were labeled and discussed in the complementary text. Similarly to what we saw with the Cambridge University's copy of Vesalius' Epitome, also this example has been watercolored by hand by the owner to further differentiate the individual elements. In the first decades of the 16th century, Dürer consolidated all the information about perspective that he had learned in Italy, publishing a treatise on the art of drawing. The manual starts with an explanation of how to draw the most basic line. Each section of the book develops this line into more and more complex forms. It was designed as a step-by-step guide for aspiring artists, although Dürer concludes it with a series of cheats designed to create easy perspective. The two woodcuts we see in this slide show contraptions designed to, apparently, easily draw accurate images of three-dimensional objects. The one on the right shows a draftsman drawing a lute. To paraphrase Dürer's own description, a draftsman uses a strong thread hammered into the wall to create the near point of sight and places a vertical frame parallel to the wall. Then a lute or other object to your liking is placed on the opposite end of the table to the wall. The near point of sight is placed on parts of the lute and string attached with hot wax to the frame to mark where the near point of sight passes through the frame. The points that the cross strings denote are then marked on your drawing tablet, creating an accurate dotted outline for the lute. This complex description visually translates to the seemingly simple diagram shown in the woodcut. The actual illustration, though, is very advanced and shows the artist's mastery in this technique. The printed book was rapidly evolving. Another interesting method for illustrating three-dimensional objects, published in the same edition, was to represent geometric solids as bidimensional shapes, which could be folded to form three-dimensional objects. These are called polyhedral nets, and Dürer, in his treatise, published nets for the Platonic solids. Here we see the cube on the left and the dodecahedron on the right, as well as several of the Archimedean solids. This is considered one of the earliest, if not the earliest, example where this technique was fully illustrated. This method of representation became very popular in geometry treatises. Here we see another example from Daniele Barbaro's La pratica della perspettiva, the practice of perspective, published in Venice in 1568. Just 2 years later, the printer John Day published in London the first complete English translation of Euclid's Elements by Henry Billingsley. The edition included nearly 1,300 diagrams. Among these, Book 11 on solid geometry included several pop-up devices. These pop-ups were the first of their kind and served didactic purposes. As we can see in the image here on the left, as well as illustrating geometric solids as wireframe models or using shadowing techniques to suggest three-dimensionality, some of the figures were to be constructed by the reader. In analogy to what we saw for Vesalius's epitome, the pop-ups were printed as flat surfaces in 6 bifolia with extensive instructions on how they were to be cut and pasted on the appropriate diagrams. These had to be hand-glued into each copy of the work, making the post-production process rather complicated and time-consuming. Another remarkable example of early boundary pushing in print is Johannes de Sacrobosco's De Sphera Mundi, an introductory guide to the geocentric universe, published in Venice in 1485 by the innovative printer Erhard Ratdolt. This edition is considered one of the first attempts to use printed color not as a merely decorative element, but to service the concept to be transmitted. In a certain sense, this follows a practice that, as we have seen earlier with our anatomical manuscript, was already established as a technique of representation. As highlighted by Kathleen Crowther and Peter Barker, the diagrams, quote, constitute a sophisticated visual and pedagogical program designed to inculcate skills in mentally visualizing the structures of the cosmos. Even more important, these images were created to train students to manipulate mental images. End quote. The pages had to go under the press for each individual color, so the process was extremely laborious, time-consuming, and not economically sustainable at the time. A popular device, adopted particularly in texts regarding astronomy and astrology, was the volvelle, a paper construction with rotating parts. The term comes from the Latin verb volvere, which means to turn. And these devices were already in use in manuscripts. Some early examples have been detected in Persia around the year 1000. Also in this case, the books came out of the press with some additional pages which included illustrations which were supposed to be cut out and pasted by the reader. An absolute masterpiece of this technique is Peter Apian's Astronomicum Caesareum.
How do you find meaning in the universe? Peter Apian was a 16th century mathematician, physician, and astronomer. When he produced a gift for his patrons, Emperor Charles V and his brother Ferdinand I, Apian turned to this question. In his printing house in Ingolstadt, Germany, he commissioned illustrator Michael Ostendorfer to embark on a project that might provide an answer. In 1540, after a decade of work, they were finally done. Apian's masterpiece features vivid, hand-colored illustrations of the sky, constellations, eclipses, and moons on thin paper discs, accented by silk threads with seed pearl markers. A manual suitable for emperors to decode the stars. This is the Astronomicum Caesareum.
Production techniques of paper instruments became very sophisticated, as we can see in this example, published in 1575 by Leonard Thurneisser, a scholar with broad scientific knowledge, whose involvement in alchemy brought denunciation from some fellow scientists. The instrument had revolving discs showing constellations and other features of the heavens that were meant to determine the course of the planets and their influences. In the late 16th century, new illustration techniques, like engravings, started to be introduced in the printed book. These allowed for more refined illustrations and sophisticated shadowings. Also, this technique involved a large number of craftsmen specializing in different tasks, from engraving the metal surface. Magnifying glasses were often required due to the precision and detail that the technique allowed. We can see the draftsman here on the right working on that, to carefully inking the plate, to putting it under the rotating press, a different machine from the one which we saw earlier. Engravings allowed more sophisticated illustrations with very thin lines, which now were engraved rather than left in relief from the woodblock, and fine shadowing, as we can see in this image representing Andrea Pozzo's Perspectiva Pictorum et Architectorum, published in Rome at the end of the century. Here instead, we can see another fabulous example, Morrison's Plantarum Historia, illustrated by full-page engravings. The original copper plates are still preserved at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. As we can see in this detail and in the copper plate below, also words had to be engraved, for this technique was not easy to combine with movable type printing. In this virtuoso display of intaglio skills, Claude Mellon represented the face of Christ on Saint Veronica's cloth, made in one continuous line of different widths. A further variation of the intaglio technique was etching, which allowed even more precise shadowing. A waxy ground was applied over the plate, and lines were scratched off this surface with a pointed needle. The plate was then immersed into acid, which bites into the metal surface, leaving behind the drawing. In this slide, we can see the difference between an illustration realized with intaglio technique above and another produced using relief technique below. The fine shadowing that we can see on the right of the figure above could not be obtained with the woodcut below. Redeman de Vrie's Perspective, published in Amsterdam in 1604-05, is an example of the sophistication that illustration techniques reached at the beginning of the 17th century. Not only the representation method is incredibly accurate, but also the technology of its execution is very advanced. Intaglio techniques, though, implied that these fantastic illustrations became isolated from the accompanying text, and the way in which readers were approaching these objects changed once again. During the 17th century, all these different techniques started to be combined. Here we see an interesting example, the so-called Tesoro Mexicano, a volume illustrating Mexican flora, fauna, and mineralogy, where etching, engravings, and woodcuts are skillfully combined. The image on the left is clearly printed from a plate. We can see the rounded angles a bit as a result of the printing process, while the illustration on the right comes from a wood block. The printed lines are in relief, so no image of the woodblock is evident. Scientific advancement and printing techniques allowed the production of richly illustrated books like Hooke's Micrographia or Hevelius's description of the moon. The introduction of new technology would also lead to deep philosophical developments. Tools for observation and communication, which became mainstream, allowed for deeper investigations into our universe and ourselves. the microscope and telescope, which would reveal untold worlds to the observational scientist and provide fresh material for philosophers to consider. Robert Flood, an Oxford-trained physician, authored his Gran Utriusque Cosmi Historia, or History of the Two Worlds, as both tools became more available to be used. His two worlds were the macrocosm and the microcosm, and his work provided an exhaustive investigation into natural observations using these two lenses. As the magnitude of telescopes continued to improve, the vastness of our universe began to unfurl. The depth and breadth of our universe began to be understood, and the vast amount of this space between heavenly bodies began to be perceived. Interestingly, Flood's visual treatment of the beginnings of the universe is startling, especially compared to the rest of his books, which are filled with intricate diagrams and engravings. Flood chose a black square, inked to oblivion, to represent the beginnings of the universe, the infinite. The square, which on each of its sides farther expounded et sic in infinitum, and so ad infinitum, is a cross-hatched copper plate engraving, a black square on the page, as dark and deep as an inkwell, which captivates the viewer as soon as they turn the page, and then is slowly built upon as Flood's universe unfurls. Here, the reproduction technique is masterly in representing the author's state of mind, more than his science. And with this black square representing everythingness or nothingness, I wish to conclude my talk, and I'm looking forward to talk more about books and images in our Q&A session. Thank you for your attention.
Laura, thank you very much. It's fascinating, and I was struck by some of the works with the flaps and the geometric shapes, which I think we've all as children been familiar with, and it's interesting to see that those were techniques that were being developed several hundred years ago. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about who was driving the technological advancement and the artistic advancement, because you've got printers, you've got artists, you've got scientists, although they may not necessarily have called themselves scientists at the time, but and a lot of the works that you have talked about are the result of a sort of combination of all of those constituencies. Are you able to say who was, to what extent the one or other of those constituencies was leading change, or was it all sort of self-feeding?
Well, we are talking about a reality which is made of hundreds of different printing presses in hundreds of different cities, covering all Europe, and all these presses were opening during the years, and it became a commercially sound enterprise as long as they were able to fix the difficulties of producing beautifully illustrated text containing costs. So we need to look at example by example. Peter Apian's Astronomicum Caesarium, for instance, he was the owner of the actual printing press. In other cases, just to mention someone in Venice, Francesco Marcolini was a printer, very famous at his time, and he was very keen in exploring and experimenting and trying something new all the times. In other cases, authors, Daniele Barbaro, for instance, was in constant dialogue with the publisher in order to have on the page precisely what he wanted. So it's like a mosaic of hundreds and hundreds of different realities, which were really very different one from the other. And there was a lot of competition, of course, because the best publishers could have larger portions of the market. So yes.
Of course, thank you. Yeah, no, I can appreciate it's a complex environment. We've got a few questions coming in. So Alison Baverstock, who is herself a publisher, has both a comment and a question. So I'll just publish both of these. So utterly fascinating, I agree. I thought publishers invented what we called then paper engineering in the 1980s with Jan Pienkowski and Spot the Dog. But her question is, do we know how many were printed of these books and how far they were circulated internationally, and were they in Latin or in the vernacular?
Mm-hmm. So again, we need to look at very different situations. Books could be produced in 1,000 copies, 2,000 copies. Sometimes we have, for instance, inventories of printing presses or written records. So we know how many books were produced by that printer in a particular year. So we have some detailed information. In other cases, we could look at survival rates, although this is a factor that we need to look at very carefully. High survival rate might also mean that the book was not very popular because people just put the book in the shelves, and this is why we have so many copies of the book, while very popular used books were destroyed because people were using them. So we have some elements that we can consider, and books were traveling fast all around Europe. It was really a phenomenon which spread very rapidly and also very widely. So it was you mentioned Palladio in your introduction. Basically, Palladio's treatise on architecture, published in 1570, was the reason why Palladianism was introduced in Britain, and is the reason why Palladio had such a huge influence in architects working in Britain in the 17th century.
Thank you. Got some more questions here. Dan Hayton thinks that you may have answered his question, but I'll ask it anyway. Were there independent publishers, or were these books the product of patronage?
Oh yes, patrons very often paid for editions. I was working recently on a patron in Verona who was very fond in paintings and music and all sorts of artistic products. And it's clear that he foraged the printing industry in town because he allowed the publishing of several books of printed music, and in their dedicatory letters, authors always are very generous with compliments with their patron. So yes, this is also another very important factor. There were patrons who were paying for the production of these books. Yes.
Thank you. And does that mean that the independent presumably there were independent publishers? These were independent firms, but relied
yes,
very heavily
they sold their books, but it was also good for them to count on some yes, funding.
yeah, indeed. Question from Catherine Marquette. Might you comment a bit more on the manipulation of involving the printed text itself? I noted the triangular shape of the text in the Dura print on optics that you showed. How does that relate to the three-dimensionality, the concurrent images or subject addressed?
So I'm trying to figure out what this is referring to, looking at my PowerPoint. Normally, all these images that I showed were also commented in the text. So there's a close relationship between the actual geometric form, in this case, and what's described in the text. Very often, as we saw, for instance, in Vesalius' treatise on anatomy, there were little letters within the body of this mannequin appended from a rope. All these elements were recalled in the text. So the relationship between the image and the text in this treatise is very, very, deep. They were really interconnected. And what happened with the introduction of engraving, so we have these big plates printed in one page and the text is in another side of the book. So you had to, while on the books with woodcuts, you had image and text very close. With the engravings, you had to move your book back and forth to go from the text to the illustration and back and forth. So it was really the technique of illustration also changed the way in which readers were interacting with their books.
Thank you. And just you referred there to in your answer to the Vesalius anatomical illustrations. So there's a question from Anna here. Thank you so much for the talk. In relation to Vesalius's illustrations of organs on sculptural bodies, is there any way of knowing how the letters were printed on the top of the woodcut illustrations? Were they included in the original woodblock with the carved image or printed second time around?
They were carved in the same block. And in fact, if you look at them closely, they look like something. There is a Z, for instance. I was looking while you were talking. They are a bit more rigid, so it's clear that they are carved into the woodblock together with the illustration.
Thank you.
Passing pages down the press multiple times. It was like printing two books, having just one copy. So it wasn't an option. That's why color printing was dismissed in this early phase, because passing the same sheet of paper under the press two times was too time consuming and not economically sound.
Thank you. I think I better take this question from our recently departed head of collections, Katrina Macara. She says she can't help but think of Kazimir Malevich's Black Square painting of 1915. Yes. Would Russian suprematists have known of these Renaissance examples?
Yes, so the Black Square has always been one of my favorite, because it's a black square, but if you think about what they want to represent with it, it's everything. So it's really a fascinating choice, in my view.
And from Jenny Herring, many thanks, Professor Moretti, for a fascinating talk. I'm curious if you see any geographical trends in particular approaches to 3D representation? For example, a Venetian style or technique that was favoured in one or another centre of printing?
There were publishers in Florence which sent woodcuts to Venice to be printed there because the best artisans were in Venice at the time. We're talking about 1568 with Vasari's second edition of the Lives. So Venice, Paris, many centers in Germany, they were leading this new industry. So again, it was a competitive market, and having the best artisan craftsmen was really important for these publishers. So it's true that there were very important production centers, but if we look at the map of Europe with all these little dots, there are several. If you Google this, it's easy to find. It was a market which expanded rapidly over Europe. So yes, having the best artisans doing the best, the nicest, the more advanced, the more economically sound editions was something which was very important at the time.
And so are there any identifiable stylistic schools as such, that just to go back to Jenny's question, or was it simply a case of finding the best artists that you could
yes,
could buy?
It's difficult to establish because, for instance, Vesalius illustrations, it is scholars are debating this, but it sounded like it was a pupil of Titian who was doing this. Okay. So probably someone who, but the book was printed in Basel, right? So books could travel, but also artists could travel, and publishers could travel. In the second half of the 15th century, we have an enormous number of publishers from the north who came to Venice, and there they established their. So it's really difficult to find trends, although clearly the big cities were the places where the best artists would normally go to because they could find more work.
Yeah. I missed this question right at the beginning from Joanna. It's a short question which I'll expand on slightly. So her question is there any research beyond Europe? Which yes. I think we could sort of expand that out. I mean, obviously your talk has been very much focused on European yes. Work, but I mean, it would be really interesting to hear about what else that was either prior to, whether in the Islamic world or thinking perhaps in Chinese, if there's other cultures who were exploring this three-dimensionality, and how that where they sit within the art historical sort of record.
Absolutely. Although I'm not a specialist on these areas, I work mainly on European, mainly on Venetian examples, but printing press, wood cutting techniques developed much earlier in the East. So examples of printed books in China were really much earlier than what we saw today. Clearly, it was a completely different kind of market, a different kind of culture, but there's an enormous amount of work being done on beyond Europe, and fabulous examples, and also, of course, paper was introduced from the East. So we're all talking about things. I was talking about things that in the East were already very well established at the time. So, but in Europe, they developed in this way. So, but yes, absolutely, there's a lot of research done on printing in these. Yes.
Yeah, and another one for another talk at some point.
Exactly. Maybe for another life of work.
Yeah. Question from Simon. In these early days of printing, what was the comparative cost of such publications, and did this limit the demographic of the audience?
Yes, I've shown books which were relatively to incredibly expensive today. The book printing also, for instance, in Venice, Aldo Manuzio started publishing little books which you could put in your pocket, which were really affordable, around 1500. So clearly, lavishly illustrated books were much more expensive. A copy of Astronomicum Caesarium by Peter Appian was really very expensive already at the time, and it is still very expensive nowadays. So, but things improved over time, and books, illustrated books, became more and more affordable. So it took time to have this process started and well established, but book progressively became more affordable.
Sorry. There are a couple of questions I know sitting in the Q&A, and I've for some reason just lost the list. So there was one about the who did the kind of the painting and the kind of the paper, the sticking on of the flaps and all that kind of stuff. And actually, that I think more broadly, you mentioned that sometimes some of these works would be sold uncoloured. Yes. or so perhaps you could talk a little bit more about that, about to what extent they were sold and consumed as finished articles, and to what extent they might be partly created or embellished by the acquirers.
Mm-hmm. So again, it's difficult to generalize here. Often books came out of the press black and white with a very simple binding, if not unbound, and in this form they were sold. Then the owner could decide if they wanted a precious binding, if they wanted the book watercolored, or even with illuminated initials, for instance, in imitation of what was happening in manuscripts at the time. And some owners could decide to cut these forms off and paste them and do a fabulous work, as we have seen in the Cambridge University Library's copy of Vesalius' Epitome. Some just remained uncut. In some cases, it was the publisher who did the job, but this was onerous for the publisher, time-consuming, and so it was easier for the publisher to sell the books in a very, how could we say, basic state, and the owners could decide what to do with their books.
Understood. So it's a bit like sort of getting the extras on a
exactly.
car.
Yes, exactly. So sometimes the publisher could provide the service, but many times it was the reader who worked their book, and decided how they wanted it.
Got it. Thank you. We're nearly out of time, but I'm going to see if we can just squeeze in 2 more questions. So another one from Alison Baverstock, so really interesting in the context of universities. Did the development of teaching materials through books tie in with the development of university reputations? So did any universities start their own press? I mean, we certainly know of some famous university
Yes.
presses, but I mean, perhaps you could talk a little bit about sort of at what point those developed and how they related to university reputations.
Very soon, absolutely. Books were very important for universities, academies, and so yes, in the cities where universities were founded, we find printing presses and a very active sort of, market. Students needed books, also scholars needed a lot of books. Scholars had huge libraries, and so it was really an interdependence, I would say. Institutions where knowledge was produced were in direct contact with publishers and the world of the printed book.
Thank you. And I've still got questions coming in, so we'll keep going. Just to go back to the question about non-European work. This is from an anonymous questioner, but was the development in Europe informed by what was happening in Eastern cultures or independent of it?
Well, it was already a global world. If you think about Venice and the relationship the city had with the East, of course, people were traveling, and so they were looking at each other's work. It's not possible to compartmentalize, yes, the book production, although of course just for the way in which text is written in different languages, this could change the way in which books are produced. An Euclid in Arab was published in Rome at the end of the 16th century, for instance, and we have a copy here in St. Andrews. So there were exchanges, probably more than we think.
Indeed. Thank you. I think we're going to have to leave it there. There are 1 or 2 questions still, which we haven't been able to get to, for which I apologise to those of you who haven't quite got to them. But we are just about out of time. So I will, before I thank Laura for her fascinating talk and responses, I just want to say that our next Saints talk will be on the 17th of January. And that will be from Dr. Bridget Bradley from the Department of Social Anthropology. We don't quite have a title for that talk yet, but I do know that Bridget is very interested in, and her current research is in issues around climate change and mental health. So that's certainly a very topical area. I don't know if that's exactly what she's going to be talking about, but certainly that's some of the context in which she is working at the moment. So please do join us for that if you possibly can. But for now, I will say thank you so much, Professor Laura Moretti, for a fascinating talk. It makes me want to get my hands on some of these things, and maybe I need to speak nicely to our special collections and go and play with some lovely books.
Many are here.
All right, okay. Oh, perfect. So thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. And do join us for the next Saints talk. And good evening from St Andrews.
Bye. Thank you.